Welcome back to my haunted library. It's Regina. I thought I would look a little vampirish today because I'm doing a review of Anne Rice's The Witching Hour. Not exactly vampire, but okay, look a little witchy. And this is not exactly the Mayfair Emerald, but this is the closest thing I had. It's actually a moonstone. And don't tell Batilda I stole her veil for this video. She'll be back next week. Anyway, I finally finished, where is it? I finally finished The Witching Hour, 1,000 pages of it, and very, very small type. But it took me a couple weeks, and this is actually the second time I've read it. So yeah, I really enjoyed being in that world, and I have the next two in the series, not quite as long, but pretty hefty. And I don't plan to read these right away, but they're on my shelves, and I will. And I've read them already. I'll read them again. So yeah, so my impressions this time, I feel like being in this world of, especially in this series, in this book, being in the world of Anne Rice's New Orleans is a very sensuous experience, and the house that is featured in this book in the Garden District is actually was Anne Rice's house, and I don't believe she owns it anymore. I think it's like a museum. And when I was in New Orleans many years ago, I went there, and I'm going to try to find. I took some photos outside. I'm going to try to find those, but it's like back in the '90s, back in the old days when I, had a Polaroid camera or something. So the book, I'm going to have some spoilers in this review, but just to give like kind of a basic background, it's a very long book, so it goes into a lot of different directions. But the basic story is that a young woman who's a doctor, she's a neurosurgeon named Rowan Mayfair, is living in San Francisco, and she's kind of this. She's only 30 years old. She's kind of like a superwoman. 30 years old. She's blonde. She's beautiful. She's brilliant. She's lives in this really cool houseboat. She's wealthy, and she's this gifted brain surgeon who isn't just extremely brilliant, but she could actually stick her hands in someone's brain and decide what's wrong with it, So she's got like this sixth sense in her hands. And she can also kill somebody at will by just thinking about how much she despises them, or if somebody gets in her way, they're dead. And not that she's done this too much, but there's like a childhood memory where some schoolyard bully dies because Rowan thinks that. So that's kind of the setup, and she's out on her. She's also a sailor. She goes out and takes her boat out. She's like I said, like a superwoman, and like a fantasy figure. And this is fantasy, although it's grounded in like a real world. And she's out on her boat, and she saves this handsome, I was going to say young man, but he's not young. He's like in his late 40s. This handsome, kind of, I pictured him like this sort of Marlboro man named Michael Curry. And she brings him back to life. And he's technically dead, but she brings it back to life. And there's like a sense that there was like a supernatural interaction that helped bring him back to life. Because then when he regains consciousness, he has psychic abilities in his hands that when he touches somebody or something, he knows like everything that's connected to that person or that thing. So if he were to touch this book, he could tell that I read it, and I bought this at a thrift store, and he would know who used to own it and what they were thinking when they had the book, and oh yeah, all this stuff comes flooding into his senses so much that it drives him crazy. So he wears gloves. So and he is also from New Orleans, and he and Rowan are in San Francisco when they meet, but Michael is originally from New Orleans, and as a boy, he became fascinated by this house on First Street, and he would look at this house, and he would see this woman who was kind of in a catatonic state wearing the emerald, and this strange man would always be like kind of standing next to her, whispering in her ear, and kind of just hovering. And that woman was Rowan's mother, and that man was a spirit called Lasher. And what happens is that Rowan and Michael get together. They have this really hot love affair, and even though Rowan was adopted, she's part of this long line of the Mayfair Witches. And they go back centuries. And there's this group called the Talamasca, who is this like watchdog organization, kind of like the Vatican in a way, but not as big, obviously. But they are like a group that has been following this psychic phenomena, following these paranormal experiences, and these witches, and this spirit called Lasher. And another major character is this Englishman named Aaron Lightner, and he is part of the Talamasca. And he's kind of like an old world gentleman. He wears tweed suits or linen suits, and that's what's really cool about. I enjoyed that part of the book. It's very Anne Rice really gets into like the beautiful clothes, and it's like real estate porn. Just there's this whole section where they move back into the old house together, Rowan and Michael, and they restore it because that's what he does. He's a Victorian home restorer who worked in San Francisco. So I mean, for me, who I own an old Victorian house that is in desperate need of repair, there was something very stimulating and wonderful about that whole section, and like this fantasy of like, wow, I wish I had $600,000 to put in my account just to renovate my house. That would be really cool. So it in a lot of ways, this book is like a fantasy. You know, it's a fantasy on many levels, and a large section of the book, the middle section, is a history. Aaron Lightner gives Michael this thick file on the Mayfair Witches that goes back to like the 1600s, when the first witch was burned at the stake, and then each witch throughout the century appears, and there are 13 witches that enable the spirit of Lasher to become flesh finally, and Rowan is the 13th witch. So I won't give away the ending. The story continues then in the next two volumes, so it's a really involved story. Part of me is like, this is great, this is fascinating, and part of me is like, why am I doing this to myself? Because it's so I mean, Anne Rice is really great at that sweet spot between like literary fiction and kind of like great trash like the Thornbirds or something, you know. It has that element to it. So there is some, I have to warn the reader, there are some very graphic sex scenes between Rowan and this demon lover Lasher, and that's also kind of part of a fantasy. Anne Rice has written a lot of erotica under different pen names, and she's very good at it. So yeah, if that kind of thing offends you, you may find The Witching Hour a little too titillating for your taste. That's all I'm going to say about that. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm glad I'm finished it, and now I can move on to something else, which is going to be my next book that I plan to read for the October season of the witch, is Harvest Home by Thomas Tryon. And it's not about witches, but it's certainly about evil and evil women. And I'm really looking forward to that. It is a reread. So yeah, that catches me up with The Witching Hour. I will read Lasher and Tautos sometimes, probably this year. I don't know. There's no rush. I got a lot of books back there. That was The Witching Hour by Anne Rice. I highly recommend it to people who love long reads that are very meandering and sensual and sexy and cool. So definitely check it out if that's your taste. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Thanks for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon. Bye.